The year of our Lord 1876 was etched into the land with a sun-scorched finger. In this corner of the West, the earth was a hard, unforgiving thing, cracked and thirsting under a sky so vast and blue, it felt like a judgment. The wind was a constant preacher, howling through the canyons and whipping dust into fine, gritty clouds that settled on everything, in the folds of a woman's dress, in the bottom of a water barrel, in the weary lines around a man's eyes. It was a land that promised freedom but often delivered only a wider, more desolate cage. For Clara Mae Thompson, the cage was gilded, at 19, with hair the color of harvested wheat and eyes the shade of a twilight sky. She was the new wife of Thomas Blackwood, a man whose name was as solid and unyielding as the granite hills his vast ranch sprawled across. He was a widower, nearly 30 years her senior, with a face carved by the same harsh elements that shaped the land. His beard was more salt than pepper, and his hands, though scrubbed clean, bore the permanent calligraphy of hard labor and harder bargains. The marriage had been one such bargain. Her father, a man with a gentle heart and a disastrous affinity for bad investments, had faced ruin. Thomas Blackwood, a creditor and an old acquaintance, had offered a solution that was both a salvation and a damnation. He would forgive the debt, a sum that would have cost her family their home and their name, in exchange for Clara's hand. She remembered the day her father, his eyes refusing to meet hers, had explained the arrangement. He had called it a providential opportunity. Clara had called it a sale. Her new home was the Blackwood Ranch, a sprawling two-story house that stood as a monument to Thomas's prosperity. It was the largest dwelling for 100 miles, with glass windows ordered from the east and furniture of dark, heavy wood that seemed to absorb the light and give nothing back. From her bedroom window, she could see for miles, rolling plains giving way to distant, saw-tooth mountains. The sheer scale of it should have felt like liberty, but it only served to amplify her solitude. She was a ship's captain with an endless ocean and no port, a bird in a sky with no branch to land on. Her life was governed by a quiet, rigid order. Breakfast was at 7, dinner at 6. Her dresses were chosen for their modesty and durability. Her conversations monitored for their propriety. Thomas was not a cruel man in the way of overt violence. His cruelty was one of omission. He gave her shelter but no warmth, provision but no partnership. He looked at her not as a wife, but as the final, most valuable acquisition to his estate, a testament to his power and a guarantee of his legacy. In his eyes, she was a broodmare with a pretty face. The silence in the house was the loudest thing she had ever known, broken only by the ticking of the grand clock in the hall, each second a hammer blow on the anvil of her captivity. Life was a flat, featureless plain until the annual Town Founders' Day picnic. It was one of the few occasions Thomas insisted she attend, a chance to display his young bride to the collection of ranchers, merchants, and their watchful wives who constituted their society. Dressed in a cornflower blue gown that Thomas had approved, its collar high and tight against her throat, Clara stood by his side, a polite smile affixed to her face like a porcelain mask. The air was thick with the smell of roasted meat, cheap perfume, and the ever-present dust. Laughter and loud talk bounced off the clapboard walls of the town hall. Thomas was in his element, a king holding court. Men clapped him on the shoulder, their respect a mixture of genuine admiration and fear. He spoke of cattle prices, of the coming railroad, of the Indian problem. Clara simply nodded when spoken to, her responses soft and brief, a well-trained echo of her husband. Her spirit felt as parched as the ground beneath her feet. It was during a moment of reprieve, while Thomas was locked in a stern discussion with the sheriff, that her gaze drifted. It swept past the clusters of gossiping women, past the children chasing a runaway dog, and settled on the fringe of the celebration, near the long shadow cast by the livery stable. There, a man stood alone. He was not part of the festivities, but an observer, a ghost at the feast. He was tall and lean, dressed in the worn, functional garb of a working cowboy. Dusty boots, faded denim, a hat pulled low. What held her attention was not his solitude, but the geography of his face. The right side was a roadmap of past violence. A long, puckered scar ran from his temple down to his jaw, pulling the corner of his eye into a permanent, sorrowful slant. Other, smaller marks crisscrossed his cheek, the remnants of a life lived at the sharp end of conflict. He held a cup of water, his hands cupped around it as if for warmth, and his gaze was fixed firmly on the ground before him. He seemed to be carrying a weight so immense it bent his very posture towards the earth. He was a stark, brutal contrast to the preening, prosperous men around her. He was real in a way that nothing else in this carefully constructed social theater was. A wave of an emotion she couldn't name, pity, perhaps, or a strange sort of recognition, washed over her. She saw in his isolation a reflection of her own. "Who is that?" she asked Martha, the blacksmith's plump, kindly wife, her voice barely a whisper. Martha followed her gaze and her smile tightened. "Oh, that's just Luke. Don't pay him no mind. Dear, he's troubled." But Clara couldn't look away. Throughout the afternoon, she found her eyes drawn back to him. He never spoke to anyone. He never smiled. When a stray child's ball rolled near his feet, he simply nudged it back with the toe of his boot without looking up. He was a fixed point of stillness in the swirling crowd. A man who had mastered the art of being invisible. Later, huddled with a group of women near the lemonade table, Clara learned more. The whispers came fast and low, a currency of secrets traded behind gloved hands. Luke, they said, had been a cavalryman, fought in the war, then came out west. He'd seen things no man should see. The scars, they murmured, were from a skirmish with a Comanche war party up at Red Creek, a few years back. They say he was the only survivor of his patrol, one woman whispered, her eyes wide. Left for dead. Thomas Blackwood's own survey party found him. Another woman, the banker's wife, leaned in closer. More than that, she said, her voice dropping conspiratorially. My husband told me the story. That Comanche raid, it was Thomas's party they were after. That boy, Luke, he held them off, took a lance meant for Mr. Blackwood himself, saved his life. He did. The revelation struck Clara with the force of a physical blow. The scarred, silent man on the edge of the crowd had saved her husband's life. He was a hero. Then, a man to whom Thomas, and by extension, she, owed an immense debt of gratitude. So why was he treated like an outcast? Why did he stand alone, shrouded in whispers and warnings? The answer came sooner than she expected. The afternoon sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and violet. The party was winding down. Clara went in search of Thomas, finding him on the porch of the town hall, sharing a cigar with Sheriff Brody. She paused in the doorway, hidden by the deepening shadows, not wanting to interrupt. He's becoming a nuisance, Thomas said, his voice a low rumble, devoid of the forced bonhomie he'd displayed all day. He exhaled a plume of blue-gray smoke. Having him here, it's an unwelcome reminder. He keeps to himself, Thomas, the sheriff replied, his tone placating. Does odd jobs, stays out of trouble. The man's been through hell. His hell is not my concern, Thomas stated, his voice as cold and hard as Riverstone. He was a soldier. He did his duty. The debt is paid, but every time I see that face, it brings back the stench of that day, the blood. He is a memory I do not wish to see walking through my town. He took another long draw from his cigar, the tip glowing like a malevolent red eye in the dusk. He brings a darkness with him. Luke is a past I want buried. Spreading word that his kind of work has dried up around here would be the decent thing to do. Driving him out of this territory is what's best for everyone. Clara recoiled as if she had been slapped. The casual cruelty of it. The dismissal of a man who had saved his life as nothing more than an unpleasant memory. chilled her to the bone. Thomas wasn't just cold, he was pathologically selfish, a man who would erase any part of his history that caused him the slightest discomfort. She slipped away before they could see her, her heart hammering against her ribs. Her breath came in short, sharp gasps. She leaned against the cool wood of the building's far wall, trying to quiet the storm inside her. She looked back across the thinning crowd. Luke was still there, in the same spot, a statue of silent suffering. But now, she saw him differently. He was not just a curiosity. He was not just a pitiful figure. He was a man who had been grievously wounded, not just in body, but in spirit, by the very world that now shunned him. And her husband, the man whose bed she shared, whose name she carried, was the chief architect of his isolation. A fragile, unfamiliar feeling began to bloom in the barren wasteland of her heart. It was a fierce, protective sympathy, a quiet outrage on behalf of a man she had never spoken to. As the last light of day bled from the sky, Clara looked at the solitary cowboy, and for the first time since coming to this land, she did not feel alone in her prison. She felt a connection, a shared sentence, with the scarred man in the shadows, and with that connection came a dangerous, terrifying, and utterly irresistible curiosity. The days that followed the Founders' Day picnic bled one into the next, each a perfect, sun-bleached copy of the last. Clara's life at the ranch settled back into its suffocating rhythm, a quiet tyranny of routine. Yet, something within her had shifted. The image of the scarred cowboy, Luke, was imprinted on her mind, a solitary figure against the backdrop of her own gilded loneliness. He was a puzzle she felt a desperate need to solve, a focal point for the restless, unnamed longings that churned within her. Her chance to see him again came unexpectedly one blistering afternoon. Tasked by Thomas with delivering a basket of preserves to Reverend Miller, she rode the gentle mare into town. The journey itself was a small taste of freedom, the wind tugging at the tendrils of hair that had escaped her bonnet, the vastness of the plains a temporary antidote to the claustrophobia of the ranch house. As she approached the small, whitewashed church, she heard the rhythmic clang of a hammer against metal. Behind the church, in a small paddock, she saw the source. Luke was there, his back to her. He was stripped to the waist, his shirt hanging on a nearby fence post. The oppressive heat had slicked his skin with a sheen of sweat that defined the hard muscles of his back and shoulders. He was bent over the raised hoof of the Reverend's old gray horse, his focus absolute. Clara reined in her mare, her throat suddenly dry. From this distance, in the unforgiving light of the afternoon sun, his scars were not just visible, they were a living testament. The long, angry line down his face was the most prominent, but she could now see a constellation of older, paler marks across his back and arms, a story of survival written on his very skin. He worked with a quiet, efficient grace, his movements economical and sure. There was a competence in his hands, a gentleness in the way he handled the horse, that seemed at odds with the violence his body had endured. Reverend Miller emerged from the back of the church, carrying a dipper of water. He was a kind-faced man with eyes that held a genuine warmth. He offered the dipper to Luke, who took it and drank deeply, the water tracing clean paths through the grime on his throat. "The Lord provides skilled hands when they are needed most," the Reverend said, smiling. "I am in your debt, son." Luke simply shook his head. Handing the dipper back, he didn't speak a word. His gratitude, or perhaps his dismissal of it, was communicated in that simple gesture. He picked up his tools to finish the job. It was then that he must have sensed her presence. His shoulders tensed, and, for a fleeting second, he turned his head just enough to see her sitting on her mare at the edge of the property. His reaction was immediate and profound. It was like watching a wild creature retreat into itself. He straightened up, his movements becoming stiff and hurried. He finished hammering the last nail, dropped the horse's hoof, and gathered his tools with a speed that bordered on frantic. He wiped a hand across his brow, grabbed his shirt from the fence, and turned to the Reverend. This time he spoke, his voice low and raspy, a sound not meant to carry. Clara couldn't hear the words, but she saw the intent. He was taking his leave. He gave the Reverend a short, sharp nod, but pointedly. He did not look in Clara's direction again. He strode away, pulling his shirt on as he went, and disappeared behind the livery stable, melting back into the shadows he seemed to prefer. He left a void in the sunlit air. The Reverend sighed, watching him go, then turned and finally noticed Clara. His kind smile returned. "Mrs. Blackwood, a pleasure to see you." Clara dismounted, her limbs feeling strangely heavy. The preserves felt foolish and trivial in her hands. "Reverend, I saw he was helping you." "Luke?" "Yes," the Reverend said, his gaze drifting towards where the man had vanished. "He has a good heart, that one, buried under a great deal of pain. He does not ask for payment, nor does he accept thanks with any grace. He simply finds work that needs doing and does it." Clara handed him the basket, the feeling in her chest a leaden weight. Luke's retreat had felt like a personal rejection, a sharp and painful reminder that she was part of the world that shunned him. She was Mrs. Thomas Blackwood, the wife of the man who wanted him gone. To him, she was not a woman. She was a symbol of her husband's power, a part of the fortress she herself was desperate to escape. The ride home was slow. The brief joy of her earlier freedom now curdled into a familiar despair. The sun was dipping low by the time she saw the imposing silhouette of the ranch house. She had dallied too long, lost in thought, and she knew she would pay for it. Thomas was waiting for her on the porch, his arms crossed over his chest, his face a thundercloud. "You are late," he said. It was not a question. "I apologize. Thomas, the heat slowed the mare." It was a feeble lie, and they both knew it. "The Reverend's is a 2-hour ride, there and back. You have been gone for 4. He stepped aside to let her pass, his presence filling the doorway. She walked into the cool dimness of the house, his footsteps heavy on the floorboards behind her. "Where did you go?" "Nowhere else. I stopped to rest the horse by the creek," she stammered, hating the weakness in her own voice. "From this day forward," he announced, his voice echoing in the silent hall, "your duties will be confined to this house and the immediate grounds. You will not ride into town. You will not leave this ranch without my express company. Is that understood?" The words were like bars slamming shut. "Thomas, that is unreasonable. I have done nothing." "You have done nothing but what I have allowed," he cut in, his voice rising, a rare crack in his iron control. "Your place is here. I will not have my wife gallivanting across the countryside like a common farm girl. You will conduct yourself with a dignity befitting my name." He gestured towards the dining room. "Dinner is in 30 minutes. See that you are appropriately dressed." He turned and walked into his study, closing the door with a definitive click. Clara stood alone in the hall, the grand clock ticking off the seconds of her newly defined sentence. She felt a hot surge of rebellion, a scream of protest trapped in her throat, but it was followed just as quickly by a wave of utter helplessness. He controlled everything, her time, her movements, her very identity. She was not Clara, she was Mrs. Blackwood, an object to be managed and displayed. That night, sleep offered no escape. She lay awake long after Thomas's heavy breathing had settled into a steady rhythm beside her. The suffocating feeling was back, pressing down on her chest. She found her mind drifting back to a time before all this. She remembered her girlhood home, a small, bustling house filled not with wealth, but with warmth. She saw her mother's face, flour dusting her cheek, her hands deftly kneading dough on the kitchen table. She could almost smell the baking bread and hear the sound of her own laughter, a free and unburdened sound. As they sat by the hearth in the evenings, the firelight dancing on their faces, it was a simple life, a poor life by Thomas's standards, but it had been hers. Here, in this grand house. She owned nothing, not even herself. Weeks turned into a month. A deep, gnawing hopelessness began to take root in Clara's soul. Then, the weather broke. The endless blue sky turned a bruised, sullen gray. A storm rolled in from the mountains, a great, cleansing fury of wind and rain. For 2 days, the world outside was a torrent, the rain lashing against the glass windows of her prison. On the third morning, the storm had gentled to a steady, persistent drizzle. An idea, born of pure desperation, took hold of her. Thomas had ridden out at dawn with his foreman to check on a northern pasture, a full day's ride. The housekeeper was confined to her bed with a fever, for the first time in weeks. Clara was unobserved. She needed to breathe. She needed to feel the rain on her face and walk on ground that wasn't owned by her husband. Donning a heavy cloak and pulling the hood low over her face, she slipped out the back of the house. She didn't take a horse. She just walked, quickly and with purpose, down the muddy track that led toward town. It was a reckless, foolish act, and every step was a defiance that both terrified and thrilled her. She was nearing the outskirts of town, where the road narrowed through a rocky outcrop. When she saw it, a horse, its coat dark with rain, stood trembling, one leg held at an awkward angle. A few yards away, a figure was struggling to rise from the muddy ground. It was Luke. Her heart leaped into her throat. She ran forward, her boots sinking into the wet earth. "Are you hurt?" He looked up, his face pale and strained with pain. Rain dripped from the brim of his hat and traced new paths down his scarred cheek. "My horse slipped on the wet stone," he grunted, trying to put weight on his leg and collapsing back with a sharp intake of breath. "Twisted my damn ankle." Clara looked around frantically. The rain was beginning to fall harder again. "We need to get you out of this storm. Can you walk if I help you?" He looked at her, truly looked at her for the first time, and she saw a flicker of confusion and mistrust in his eyes. He was about to refuse. She could see it in the set of his jaw. "Please," she said, her voice firm, leaving no room for argument. "The old minister's cottage is just through those trees. It's abandoned, but it's dry. Let me help you." Hesitantly, he nodded. She moved to his side, letting him sling a heavy arm over her shoulders. He was leaner than Thomas, but dense with muscle, and his weight was a solid, grounding presence. Every step was an agony for him, his breath hissing through his teeth. They moved slowly, a single, struggling entity against the driving rain, and finally reached the dilapidated cottage. The door groaned open on rusted hinges. Inside, it was dim and smelled of damp earth and decay, but it was shelter. Clara helped him to a rickety wooden chair, the only piece of furniture left in the room, before turning to examine his ankle. It was already swelling badly. "This needs to be bound," she said, her own voice sounding distant to her ears. She looked at her own clothes, her fine wool cloak. Without a second thought, she tore a long, clean strip from the hem of her petticoat. She knelt before him in the dirt, her hands gentle as she began to wrap the ankle, her touch clinical and focused. He was shivering, a deep tremor that ran through his whole body, a combination of cold and shock. The silence was broken only by the drumming of rain on the roof and his own ragged breathing. "Why are you helping me?" he finally asked, his voice a low rasp. Clara finished tying the knot on the binding before she looked up at him. "Because you were hurt, and because no one else would." His gaze fell to his hands. "Your husband, he wouldn't want you here." "My husband is not here," she replied, her own words surprising her with their sharp edge of defiance. She sat back on her heels, looking at the man whose story had haunted her for weeks. "The scars. The Reverend told me you were a soldier." He flinched, as if the word itself were a blow. "I was," he said, his voice flat. He stared at a spot on the far wall, his eyes seeing something long past. "I was a boy who thought putting on a blue uniform made him a man. It It just makes you a target." He traced the long scar on his face with a trembling finger. "This was from a lance. The others, shrapnel, knives, souvenirs from a tour of hell." He fell silent, but the story was not over. She could feel it hovering in the air between them. She stayed quiet, waiting, giving him the space his own town denied him. "There was a girl," he said after a long moment, his voice barely audible over the rain. "Before the war, Abigail. We grew up together. I carried a picture of her through every battle. Promised her I'd come home and we'd build a farm. I wrote it all in my letters. The house we'd have, the children." He let out a breath that was half laugh, half sob. "Took me a year to recover enough to travel. When I finally got back, her father told me she'd been married for 6 months, to a merchant from the city. He said they all thought I was dead." He looked at Clara then, and the pain in his eyes was so raw, so deep. It stole her breath. She didn't wait. I suppose I can't blame her. The man who came back wasn't the boy who left. He was shaking more violently now, the memories dredging a chill from deep within his bones. An instinct, pure and overwhelming, moved her. Clara reached out and took his hand. His skin was rough with calluses, his fingers icy cold, but his grip, when it closed around hers, was surprisingly strong. He looked down at their joined hands as if it were a foreign object. He didn't pull away. The tremor in his body slowly began to subside, the simple warmth of her touch a silent anchor in his storm. And in that moment, kneeling on the dirt floor of a ruined cottage, holding the hand of a broken man the world had thrown away, Clara felt a profound and undeniable shift deep within her soul. The cold, empty rooms of the ranch, the weight of Thomas's name, the suffocating shroud of her life, it all dissolved. Here, in this act of simple, forbidden compassion. She was not Mrs. Blackwood. She was Clara, and for the first time since she could remember, she felt terrifyingly, exhilaratingly, and completely alive. The single act of defiance in the rain-soaked cottage had ignited a spark in Clara, a dangerous ember of hope she knew she must either fan into a flame or let die. To let it die would be to return to the living death of her marriage, a fate she could no longer stomach. She chose to fan the flame. This required a level of cunning she hadn't known she possessed. She began by weaving a careful, plausible lie. In town lived a woman named Mrs. Hemlock, the elderly widow of a rancher who had died some years prior. She was a respectable, reclusive figure, known for her piety and her ailments. She was the perfect alibi. Clara approached Thomas one evening after dinner, her demeanor a careful blend of wifely duty and Christian charity. "Thomas," she began, her hands folded demurely in her lap, "Reverend Miller mentioned to me that poor Mrs. Hemlock is suffering from a terrible rheumatism this season. She has no family to look in on her. I thought it would be a charitable act to visit her once a week, to bring her a bit of soup, perhaps help with her mending." Thomas looked at her over the top of his ledger. His eyes narrowed in suspicion. His immediate instinct was to refuse, to keep her tethered to the ranch, but the request was shrewdly chosen. To deny such a pious, public-spirited request would make him look like a tyrant, a perception he could not abide. His reputation in the community was paramount. "You would go alone?" he asked, his tone flat. "It is but a short ride, and it is a widow's home, hardly a place of ill repute." Clara countered softly, "It would reflect well upon us. On your good name." That was the key. His good name. He considered it for a long moment, the silence stretching taut between them. "Very well," he conceded. The words clipped. "One afternoon a week, for no more than 3 hours. You will go directly there and directly back. Do you understand me?" Clara. "Perfectly. Thomas," she said, her heart hammering with a treacherous victory. "Thank you." And so the ritual began. Every Tuesday afternoon, Clara would pack a small basket with a jar of broth and a loaf of bread, a prop for her benevolent deception, and ride into town. She would make a brief, dutiful stop at Mrs. Hemlock's small cottage, enduring 20 minutes of conversation about aches and the weather before making her excuses. From there, she would guide her mare off the main road, her heart beginning to race, toward the overgrown path that led to the abandoned minister's cottage on the hill. Luke was always waiting for her. That derelict shack became their world. In those stolen hours, insulated from the judgment of the town and the cold authority of the ranch, they were not the outcast and the rancher's wife. They were simply Luke and Clara. The space, initially damp and sad, was transformed by their presence. He had patched the leak in the roof and found 2 sturdy crates to serve as chairs. She brought a clean wool blanket to ward off the chill and, in a small tin pot, coffee grounds and sugar. Their intimacy was built not on grand declarations, but on small, shared rituals. She learned to make coffee the way he liked it, boiled over a small, smokeless fire, black and strong enough to fortify a man against a hard world. The first time she made it, it was a watery, bitter failure. He'd taken a sip, a rare ghost of a smile touching his lips. "City coffee?" He'd tease gently. The next week, she watched him, memorizing the precise moment he pulled the pot from the flames. When she handed him the next cup, he drank it slowly, his eyes closing for a moment in simple pleasure. The quiet look of gratitude he gave her was more precious than any jewel Thomas could have bought her. In turn, he learned the delicate architecture of her life. He learned to listen. She spoke of the books she read, of the life in the East she barely remembered, of the person she used to be before her name was erased and replaced by his. He listened with an intensity that made her feel seen for the first time. He never pitied her. He simply understood. One afternoon, racing to meet him, her mare stumbled, spattering the hem of her dress with thick mud. She arrived at the cottage distressed, knowing Thomas would notice the stain. Without a word, Luke took a damp cloth and knelt before her, carefully, patiently working the mud from the fabric. To do so, he had to unlace the back of her bodice slightly to spread the material. The first time his rough, calloused fingers brushed against the sensitive skin of her back, a shiver traced its way up her spine. His hands trembled, a betraying tremor that spoke of a reverence and a fear that touched her deeply. But as the weeks went on, these small intimacies became their language. A time came when her dress was caught on a bramble, and he had to help her untangle it. His hands moved to the laces of her dress, and this time, they were steady. He learned to tie the delicate ribbons without fumbling, his touch becoming sure and familiar, a secret knowledge that belonged only to him. Their connection deepened with every meeting, simmering beneath the surface of their quiet conversations. It was in the way his eyes would follow her as she moved about the small room, a look of profound, aching tenderness. It was in the way her hand would accidentally brush his as she passed him a cup, sending a jolt through them both that made them snatch their hands away like children. Their gazes would meet across the flickering firelight and hold for a breath too long, a silent, dangerous confession passing between them. They were falling in love, a desperate, hopeless love that bloomed in the shadows, beautiful and doomed. The days grew shorter, the air taking on the crisp edge of autumn. The risks they were taking grew with every passing week. One evening, a sudden, violent thunderstorm erupted, turning the path back to the ranch into a treacherous river of mud. It was too dangerous for Clara to ride home. She was trapped with him, the storm providing an excuse she could use with Thomas later. But in the moment, it felt like the hand of fate closing them in. Darkness fell, absolute and complete, broken only by the flashes of lightning that illuminated the cottage in stark, ghostly tableaus. Luke had built up the fire, and they sat on the blanket, its warmth a small island in the vast, roaring night. The storm outside seemed to amplify the intimacy within. The world was reduced to the two of them, the crackle of the fire, and the frantic beating of their own hearts. Clara found herself staring at his face. softened by the firelight. She raised a hand, her fingers tracing the path of the long scar on his cheek. He flinched at her initial touch, a lifetime of shame and pain ingrained in his reaction. But he did not pull away. He held perfectly still, his eyes locked on hers, allowing her this intimate exploration. Her touch was not one of pity, but of a strange, fierce reverence. This mark was a part of him. It was a testament to his survival, a symbol of the injustice he had suffered, and she loved him for it.
"It doesn't make you ugly, Luke,"
she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "It makes you, you." Something in him broke. A sound, a raw and unguarded groan, escaped his throat. He leaned into her touch, and then his hand came up to cup the back of her neck, his thumb stroking her skin. The space between them vanished. His lips met hers, tentatively at first, then with a desperate, pent-up hunger that she met with her own. It was a kiss of shared solitude and forbidden longing, a collision of two souls starved for connection. The world outside, with its rules and its judgments, ceased to exist. There was only the warmth of his mouth, the rough texture of his jaw against her palm, the scent of rain, wood smoke, and man that filled her senses. He gently lowered her back onto the blanket, his body a warm, protective weight over hers. His kisses moved from her mouth to her jaw, down the column of her throat, her hands tangled in his hair, pulling him closer. He fumbled with the buttons of her dress, his breath coming in ragged bursts against her skin. When his hand finally slipped beneath the layers of linen and chemise to touch the bare skin of her waist, she gasped. His skin was warm against hers, a stark, electrifying contrast. It was this touch, this simple, profound contact of skin on skin, that shattered her restraint.
"Luke,"
she breathed, a ragged, desperate whisper. It was the first time she had said his name in such a way, not as a statement, but as a prayer, a plea, a surrender. The sound of his own name, spoken with such raw need, seemed to strike him like a physical blow. It broke the spell. He froze, his body going rigid above hers. He pulled back, his eyes wide in the firelight, filled with a dawning horror. Clara saw the shift, and the reality of what they were doing crashed down upon her with the force of a physical wave. The firelight glinted off the plain gold band on her left hand. Thomas's wife. The words screamed in her mind. She was a wife, a perjurer, an adulteress. A sob of shame and despair caught in her throat. Luke rolled off her immediately, putting space between them. He sat up, running a shaking hand through his hair, his back to her. The silence in the cottage was suddenly immense, broken only by the distant rumble of thunder and Clara's own choked breaths as she hastily pulled her dress back together. "Clara, he started, his voice thick with regret.
"No,"
she whispered, tears streaming down her face.
"It was me.
He rose to his feet and walked to the other side of the small room, creating a chasm between them. He stood with his hands braced against the rough wooden wall, his head bowed. When he finally turned to face her, his expression was one of profound, soul-deep pain. "I can't do this," he said, his voice quiet but resolute. "I can't be this man." He looked at her, and his eyes were filled with a love so pure it was agonizing. "You are another man's wife. Whatever he is, whatever he's done, that is a line I cannot cross." He shook his head, a gesture of self-loathing. "I am not the kind of man who steals another man's wife." He grabbed his drenched hat from a peg by the door, not even bothering with a coat. He looked at her one last time, his face a mask of heartbreak and grim resolve. Then he opened the door and walked out into the raging storm, leaving Clara alone in the flickering firelight, shivering with a cold that had nothing to do with the weather. The change in Clara was subtle at first, a shift in the atmosphere of the house that only a man as obsessively observant as Thomas Blackwood would notice. He was a rancher who knew his stock, and in his mind, his wife was the most prized of his herd. He began to see signs that this prize was becoming unruly, her spirit wandering from its designated pasture. It was in the small things. She developed a habit of humming to herself, quiet, nameless tunes that seemed to spring from a secret well of contentment. There were moments he would find her staring out a window, a soft, distant smile on her lips, as if watching a scene only she could see. At the dinner table, a new light sometimes flickered in her eyes, a spark of inner life that had not been there before. Most damningly, she grew restless in their shared bed. She would lie awake for hours, her breathing soft but uneven, and when she finally slept, she would sometimes turn away from him, a sigh escaping her lips that sounded suspiciously like relief. To Thomas, these were not the signs of a woman finding a quiet happiness. They were symptoms of a sickness, a rebellion of the soul. His wife was his property, and his property was malfunctioning. The weekly trips to visit the widow Hemlock, once a tolerable exercise in public piety, now became the focal point of his suspicion. An animal that strays from the herd is always heading toward something or someone. His methods were as cold and efficient as his business dealings. He did not confront her. He did not raise his voice. He simply hired a man, a quiet hand from a neighboring ranch named Silas, a man with no loyalties in town and a face that was easy to forget. The instructions were simple: follow her, report her every move. A week later, Silas delivered his report in the dim, leather-scented confines of Thomas's study. The words were spare, factual, and utterly condemning. She goes to the widow's house, Mr. Blackwood, stays maybe half an hour. Then she rides up to the old minister's place on the hill. She was there for near on 2 hours before she came back. Silas did not need to say more. The deception was the crime. The abandoned cottage, a place of privacy and ruin, was the venue. The length of time she spent there was the confession. Thomas sat behind his desk, his face an unreadable mask of granite, the only sign of his fury a tightening of the muscles along his jaw. He paid Silas in coin, dismissed him with a curt nod, and then he waited. Clara returned that afternoon, her face flushed from the crisp air, the secret light in her eyes shining brighter than ever. She walked into the house, and he was there, standing in the hall like a sentinel. "You had a pleasant visit?" he asked, his voice deceptively mild. "Yes, Thomas, Mrs. Hemlock is feeling much stronger," she replied, beginning to unpin her hat. "That is good to hear," he said, stepping closer, "because it will be your last one." Clara froze, her hands still in the air. "What do you mean?" "It has become clear to me, Clara, that you are not well. These excursions are taxing your nerves. You have become agitated, distracted." He used the words like a doctor diagnosing a fever, his tone devoid of emotion. "I have decided you are in need of a period of extended rest. For your own health, you will remain in the house until I deem you recovered." The blood drained from her face. "You cannot be serious. You mean to lock me in?" "I mean to care for you, as is my duty as your husband," he corrected her, his voice turning to ice. "The doors will be locked for your own safety, to ensure your rest is not disturbed. Mrs. Gable will see to your needs." It was a prison sentence delivered as a prescription. She looked into his eyes and saw not a hint of concern, only the cold, hard glint of ownership. The trap had sprung. She was caged. The days that followed were a descent into a gray, featureless hell. Hope, the fragile spark she had nurtured for weeks, was methodically extinguished. The heavy velvet drapes in her bedroom were kept drawn, plunging the room into a perpetual twilight. Her meals were brought to her on a tray by Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper, whose face was a study in stony indifference. When Clara tried to speak to her, to ask a question, she was met with a shake of the head and a finger to the lips. She was a ghost in her own home, her existence reduced to the silent consumption of food and air. The grand clock in the hall, once just a marker of her slow days, now sounded like the tolling of a funeral bell, each tick an echo in the tomb of her life. She would stand at the window, pulling back a sliver of the curtain to stare out at the vast, free world she could no longer touch. She watched the ranch hands ride out, their forms shrinking into the distance, and a physical ache would bloom in her chest, a longing so powerful it felt like it might tear her apart. Her only thoughts were of Luke. Where was he? Did he know what had happened? Did he come to the cottage on Tuesday, only to find it empty? The not knowing was a special kind of torture. The answer, when it came, was delivered with a casual, devastating cruelty. One afternoon, while sitting in the suffocating silence of her room, she heard the voices of two maids gossiping in the hallway as they cleaned. "Finally gone, then," one said. "Heard he packed his saddlebags this morning."
"The scarred one, Luke?"
the other replied. "About time. Never did like the look of him. Mr. Blackwood will be pleased as punch." The word struck Clara with the force of a physical blow. Gone. He had left. He had left without a word, without a sign. He had waited one Tuesday, found her absent, and simply moved on. His declaration in the cottage, "I am not the kind of man who steals another man's wife," had not been a statement of principle in a moment of crisis. It had been his final word on the matter. He had abandoned her. Clara sank onto the floor, a silent scream trapped in her throat. The last ember of hope she had been protecting deep inside her was now a cold, gray ash. He was gone. The world she had built with him in that small, secret place had been an illusion. She was utterly, irrevocably alone. A profound, directionless despair settled over her, a fog so thick she could no longer see a day ahead. A week later, a visitor broke the monotony of her confinement. Reverend Miller, even Thomas in his tyrannical control, could not bar the door to a man of God without inviting serious questions from the town. The visit was conducted in the formal parlor, with Thomas present, a silent, imposing watchdog ensuring the conversation remained on spiritual matters. The Reverend spoke of Scripture, of faith in times of trial. His words were for Thomas's benefit, but his kind eyes were fixed on Clara, and in them she saw a deep and genuine pity. As he prepared to leave, he handed her a small, leather-bound book of Psalms. "Read Psalm 27, my child," he said, his voice imbued with a quiet significance. "It speaks of courage in the face of fear. May it bring you comfort." Thomas nodded his approval, but as Clara took the book, she felt the unmistakable shape of a folded piece of paper tucked between the pages. Her heart gave a violent lurch. She kept her expression placid, murmuring her thanks as the Reverend was shown out. As soon as she was alone in her room, her hands trembling so badly she could barely function, she opened the book. The note was there. The handwriting was rough, unfamiliar. But the words were all Luke. "Clara, the pastor is a good man. He is the only one I can trust. I waited. I did not understand. Now I do. He has you locked away. This is my last message to you. I am leaving this territory for good. But not yet. If you ever truly chose me, in your heart, not just in a moment of passion, then prove it. Come to the cottage tomorrow night. The storm moon will be full. It will be light enough to travel. If you are there, we leave together. If you are not, I ride on at dawn, and I will never return." Luke. It was not a plea. It was an ultimatum, a precipice. He was offering her a choice that was no choice at all. It was a choice between two kinds of death: the slow, suffocating death of her life with Thomas, or the swift, social death of abandoning her marriage and running away with a penniless outcast. She spent the rest of the day and the long, sleepless night in a torment of indecision. Her mind was a battlefield. One voice, the voice of her father, of society, of Thomas, screamed at her, "Adulteress, sinner! You made a vow. This is your duty." It spoke of shame, of ruin, of the damnation that awaited a woman who broke the sacred bonds of marriage. But another voice, a quieter, deeper voice that came from her very soul, whispered his name. Luke. It was a voice that conjured not abstract concepts of sin and duty, but the powerful, undeniable truth of her senses. She closed her eyes, and she was back in the cottage, the realest place she had ever been. She could feel the rough, puckered texture of the scar beneath her fingertips, a map of his pain that she had accepted as her own. She could smell the scent of him, a mixture of horse, sweat, and wood smoke, the scent of a real, living man. She could hear his voice, a low rumble that spoke of a broken past but offered a future. She remembered his whispers against her neck, words that made her feel cherished and alive. This was her truth. Her marriage to Thomas was a lie, a business transaction she was forced to honor with her body and her life. Her connection to Luke was the only honest thing she had ever known. To deny it would be the greatest sin of all, a betrayal of her own heart. As the first pale light of dawn crept through the gap in her curtains, Clara stood and walked to the window. She stared at her reflection in the glass, a pale, haunted woman with fear in her eyes. A prisoner. Luke's letter was clutched in her hand, a fragile paper key to a dangerous, unknown world. She thought of the life that awaited her if she stayed, an endless succession of silent, gray days, watched over by a man who owned her but did not see her. And she thought of the life that might be, a life of hardship, of uncertainty, of poverty, but a life of freedom, a life where she would be loved, a life where she would be Clara. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but beneath it, a new, hard resolve was beginning to form. She would not die in this room. She would not let the ghost in the window be her future. She made her choice. The escape began with the setting of the sun, as dusk bled into a bruised, violent twilight. The storm that had been threatening all day finally broke its leash. It did not arrive with a gentle patter, but with a roar, a furious aerial assault that shook the very foundations of the ranch house. Wind howled through the eaves like a vengeful spirit, and rain came down not in drops but in solid, wind-driven sheets that hammered against the window panes. It was a terrible, beautiful chaos, and it was Clara's cover. Thomas, confident in his cage of wood and glass, had retired to his study after dinner, a decanter of whiskey at his elbow to wait out the tempest. The housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, had long since retreated to her own quarters at the back of the house, her fear of thunderstorms a well-known fact. Clara was alone, unobserved, the storm's fury a perfect cloak for her own. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, a rhythm that matched the storm's chaotic percussion. She had planned her route 100 times in her mind. Not the doors. They were heavy, bolted, and too close to Thomas's study. It had to be the window in the downstairs pantry, a small sash window whose lock she had painstakingly, secretly oiled over the past day. Dressed in her plainest, darkest dress, she slipped from her room. She moved through the darkened house like a phantom, her stockinged feet making no sound on the polished wood floors. The house, her prison, was a maze of menacing shadows, each familiar piece of furniture now a hulking, silent guard. The grandfather clock in the hall seemed to tick louder, each second a potential betrayal. In the pantry, the air was cool and smelled of soap and dried herbs. With trembling fingers, she worked the latch on the window. It gave way with a soft click that was swallowed by a deafening clap of thunder. She pushed the window up, and the storm rushed in to meet her, a blast of cold, wet air that smelled of ozone and damp earth. It was the scent of freedom. Climbing out was clumsy, undignified. She scraped her hands on the rough wood of the frame and tore the hem of her dress on a rosebush planted beneath the window. But she was out. She was free. For a moment, she stood pressed against the side of the house, the rain plastering her hair to her face, her dress instantly soaked through. The world was a churning maelstrom of wind and water. The journey to the cottage was a battle. The neat path was gone, replaced by a sucking, treacherous river of mud that pulled at her boots with every step. She left the relative safety of the open track and plunged into the woods, hoping the trees would offer some shelter. Instead, they became a new kind of enemy. Skeletal branches, stripped of their autumn leaves, clawed at her face and cloak. Thorny vines snagged her skirt, tearing at the fabric as if trying to hold her back, to drag her back to her cage. Lightning split the sky, and in its fleeting, brilliant flashes, the world was transformed into a terrifying, stark landscape of black and white. The woods were a tangled, writhing mass. The path was invisible. She navigated by instinct alone, her mind fixed on a single point of light she knew she would find, a single man who would be waiting. Fear was a cold, hard knot in her stomach, but beneath it was a resolve so fierce it burned. Every step was an act of rebellion. Every scratch, every stumble, was a price she was willing to pay. She nearly wept with relief when she finally saw it. A faint, warm, rectangular glow through the thrashing trees. The cottage. A lamp was lit in the window, a beacon in the tempestuous darkness. Hope, powerful and overwhelming, surged through her, giving her the strength for the final push. She stumbled out of the woods and into the small clearing, a bedraggled, mud-spattered creature barely recognizable as the refined Mrs. Blackwood. The door to the cottage flew open before she reached it. Luke stood there, framed in the lamplight. He was soaked, his hair slicked to his head, his worn coat dripping onto the floorboards. The lines of exhaustion and worry on his face were carved deep, and his eyes, they were a raw mixture of disbelief, relief, and a pain so profound it mirrored her own. He had been waiting, pacing, agonizing. There were no words. Language had no place in a moment so elemental. She half ran, half stumbled the last few feet, and he met her halfway, his arms closing around her with a desperate, crushing force. It was not a gentle embrace. It was a collision. It was the coming together of two drowning people who had finally found a piece of driftwood in a raging sea. Clara buried her face in his shoulder, her body racked with sobs of fear and relief and 1,000 other emotions for which she had no names. She clung to him, her fingers digging into the rough fabric of his coat, memorizing the solid, real feel of him. He held her just as tightly, one hand tangled in her wet hair, the other pressed to the small of her back, holding her as if he feared the storm might tear her away from him. He guided her inside, kicking the door shut against the howling wind. The small room was an island of warmth and quiet in the heart of the storm. A fire crackled in the hearth, and the single lamp cast a soft, golden glow over everything. He led her to the fire and began to peel away her soaked cloak, his movements urgent but gentle. "Clara," he finally whispered, his voice thick and raspy. The single word was freighted with all the fear and hope of the past weeks. She looked up at him, her vision blurred by tears. She reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the familiar, beloved line of his scar. He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch. All the barriers, all the hesitations were gone, washed away by the storm and her terrifying journey to him. With hands that trembled with a will of their own, she reached for the buttons of his damp shirt. It was a gesture of supreme intimacy, an unspoken question, and a declaration. He stood perfectly still, allowing her this possession. She worked the buttons free, one by one, her knuckles brushing against the cold, damp skin beneath. She pushed the shirt open and laid her palm flat against his chest. She could feel the frantic, heavy beat of his heart, a rhythm that matched her own. Her hand moved upward, over the hard muscle of his shoulder, to the scarred landscape of his face and neck. These marks, which the world saw as blemishes, as a sign of his ugliness and disgrace, were, to her, a sacred text. They told the story of his pain, his survival, his strength. The scar that had once made him hang his head in shame now felt to her like a badge of honor, A wave of love so fierce, so protective, washed over her that it left her breathless. She was not healing a wound. She was honoring it. A low groan escaped his throat, a sound of pure, unadulterated anguish and release. He pulled her flush against him, his bare skin a shock of warmth against the cold, wet fabric of her dress.
I don't need anything but you,
he whispered, his voice raw, his lips moving against her hair.
No land, no gold, nothing. Just say you belong to me. Clara, say it.
The tears she had been holding back broke free, a torrent of cathartic release.
I do,
she sobbed into his chest.
I have always belonged to you. Luke, only you.
That was all. That was everything. It was the breaking of one vow and the making of a new, truer one. He lifted her into his arms as if she weighed nothing and carried her to the blanket he had laid before the fire. What followed was not a transgression, but a reclamation. It was a desperate, fervent, and profoundly tender act of defiance against the world that had tried to keep them apart. They shed their wet, torn clothes, the uniforms of their separate prisons, and with them, all the constraints of society, all the rigid rules, all the suffocating expectations. In the warm, flickering light of the fire, they were stripped bare. Not just in body, but in soul. Every touch was a discovery, every kiss a revelation. It was a frantic, hungry exploration, and yet it was as peaceful and natural as breathing. For the first time, Clara felt wholly and completely herself, her body not an object of duty, but an instrument of love. And for the first time, Luke allowed himself to be touched not with pity, but with adoration, to be seen not as a monster, but as a man worthy of love. They moved together, a rhythm dictated by months of unspoken longing, a dance of pure, unadorned emotion. The storm raged outside, its fury a wild symphony to their own. But inside the small cottage, there was only a profound and absolute peace. In each other's arms, they had found their shelter, their home, their salvation. Later, they lay tangled together on the blanket, their bodies slick with sweat, the firelight playing over their skin. The storm had begun to recede, its fury spent, leaving a quieter, more intimate world in its wake. Luke's arm was a heavy, comforting weight across her waist, his breathing slow and even against her hair. For the first time in her life, Clara felt a sense of rightness, a feeling of being in the exact place she was meant to be in the universe. She closed her eyes, a smile of pure contentment on her lips.
Crack!
The sound was not thunder. It was the splintering of wood, violent and immediate. The cottage door, their flimsy shield against the world, burst inward, torn from its hinges. A figure stood silhouetted against the tumultuous, dark night. He was drenched, a hulking shape of pure, unadulterated menace. He held a lantern high, and its wild, swinging light fell upon the two of them on the floor, tangled and naked in the fire's glow. It was Thomas. His face was a contorted mask of disbelief and incandescent fury, his eyes reflecting the lantern light, glowing like two malevolent red coals. The moment was a frozen tableau of damnation. For a heartbeat, the only sounds were the dying roar of the storm and the frantic, ragged breaths of the three people in the room. Clara, exposed and vulnerable, saw not a husband but a primordial force of vengeance. Luke, moving with the instinct of a soldier, scrambled to place his body in front of hers, a futile shield of flesh against the inferno that was to come. Thomas's first coherent sound was a guttural roar, a sound of pure, animalistic rage that ripped from his throat. He lunged, not for Luke, but for Clara, his hand outstretched like a claw. "Whore!" he bellowed, the word a physical blow in the small space. Luke moved, a blur of muscle and desperation, tackling Thomas at the waist. The two men crashed to the floor in a tangle of limbs. Thomas, heavier and fueled by a black, murderous fury, had the advantage. He brought the heavy lantern down, smashing it against the side of Luke's head. Glass shattered. Hot oil spattered, and the lamp's flame sputtered and died, plunging the room into near total darkness, illuminated only by the dying, red glow of the fire. Luke grunted in pain but didn't release his hold in the crimson gloom. Clara saw him trying to restrain Thomas, not to harm him, but Thomas was beyond reason. He was a force of nature. He drove his elbow back into Luke's face, a sickening crunch echoing in the small room. Luke's grip loosened, and Thomas was on him, his thick fingers closing around Luke's throat.
"I'll kill you! I'll kill you! You animal!"
Thomas snarled, his voice a choked rasp.
"No!"
Clara screamed, scrambling for her discarded chemise, anything to cover herself. The shame was a physical, burning thing, but the terror for Luke's life was greater.
"Thomas, stop, please!"
Her voice seemed to break through his rage, but not in the way she hoped. His head snapped up, his eyes finding her in the dim light. He released Luke, who collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. Thomas rose, a terrifying, hulking shadow, and stalked toward her. He grabbed the woolen blanket from the floor and threw it at her.
"Cover yourself,"
he commanded, his voice dripping with a venom so cold it was more terrifying than his rage. He turned his back on her, a gesture of ultimate contempt, and prodded the dazed Luke with the toe of his boot.
"Get up!"
The journey back to the ranch was a nightmare rendered in shades of gray and black. Thomas did not speak a word. He half dragged, half pushed Clara through the mud and the dying storm, his grip on her arm a band of iron. She was barefoot, stumbling over rocks and roots, the thin blanket her only protection against the cold and her own searing shame. He moved with a relentless, punishing pace, pulling her along as if she were a disobedient piece of livestock. When they reached the house, he thrust her through the front door into the silent, waiting hall. The grand clock read 2:30. He let go of her arm, and she nearly fell. He turned and bolted the heavy door, the sound echoing through the house like a prison gate slamming shut. Then he turned to face her. In the cold, unforgiving light of the hallway lamp, she saw his face clearly for the first time since he had found them. The rage had cooled, settled into something far more dangerous, a glacial, controlled hatred. He raised his hand and struck her across the face. The blow was not wild, it was deliberate, punishing, precise. Her head snapped to the side, and a universe of stars exploded behind her eyes. The sting was immediate, a hot, blossoming pain that was quickly followed by the metallic taste of blood in her mouth. She staggered back, catching herself on the wall, her hand flying to her cheek. "You are a disgrace," he said, his voice a low, level whisper that was more chilling than any shout. "You have defiled my home, my name, my bed. You are less than nothing." He grabbed her arm again, his fingers digging into the bruise he had already made, and pulled her up the stairs. He did not take her to their bedroom but to a small, spare guest room at the end of the hall. It was cold and bare, containing only a narrow bed and a small, barred window. He threw her inside. "You will stay here," he said, his voice flat and final. "You will see no one. You will speak to no one. You will reflect on your sin, and you will pray for a forgiveness you do not deserve." He paused at the door, his hand on the knob. "And if you ever, for 1 second, think of defying me again, I will not be so merciful. I will take you into town, stand you on the steps of the church, and tell every soul what you are. They will not see a victim, Clara. They will see a fallen, lustful woman who betrayed a good man. They will shun you. They will spit on you. You will be utterly, completely alone. Is that what you want?" She could only shake her head, silent tears now streaming down her face, mixing with the blood from her cut lip. He gave a curt, satisfied nod. Then he closed the door, and she heard the unmistakable final sound of a key turning in the lock. While Clara was entombed in silence, Thomas moved with swift,
cold purpose. He did not wait for dawn. He rode into town, his face a mask of grim, righteous sorrow. He went first to the sheriff, then to the mayor. He did not paint himself as a cuckolded husband. That would invite pity and ridicule. Instead, he crafted a narrative of violation. The scarred drifter, the troubled veteran. Luke had become obsessed with his young, innocent wife. He had stalked her, filled her head with lies, and in a moment of weakness, lured her away during the storm. Thomas had, of course, rescued her from the clutches of this dangerous degenerate. The town, already predisposed to mistrust the silent, scarred man, readily consumed the story. Whispers turned to angry murmurs, murmurs to open threats. Luke, who had managed to stumble away from the cottage, his head bleeding, his ankles screaming in protest, was no longer just an outcast. He was a predator, a threat to the moral order. By noon the next day, a posse of sorts had formed. They were not lawmen, just ranchers and shopkeepers, their faces hard with self-righteous anger. They carried lanterns and ropes. The words tar and feather were spoken, but underneath them, the uglier word lynch hung in the air. "We ought to string up any man who violates the sanctity of a marriage," one man declared from the saloon steps, to the roaring approval of the crowd. They fanned out, a hunting party in search of human prey. The only dissenting voice belonged to Reverend Miller. Luke, knowing he had nowhere else to turn, had made his way to the church, collapsing on the steps just before dawn. The Reverend had found him, cleaned his wounds, and hidden him in the small cellar beneath the pulpit. When the mob, led by a stern-faced Sheriff Brody, came to the church, the Reverend met them at the door, his slight frame a surprisingly firm barrier. "The man you seek is not here," he said, his voice calm but unyielding. "Reverend, we have it on good authority," the sheriff began. "You have it on the authority of an angry, prideful man," the Reverend interrupted, his gaze sweeping over the faces in the crowd. "I know you all. I know you to be good, Christian men. But what you are contemplating now is not justice. It is vengeance. It is a sin far greater than the one you claim to be punishing." "He dishonored a good man's wife," someone shouted from the back. The Reverend's voice rose, filled with a sudden, fiery passion. Did he, or did he offer comfort to a lonely, unhappy soul? You see a contract of marriage, a deed of ownership. But I tell you that the Lord sees the heart. He sees the truth that lies beneath the vows and the ceremonies. Do not set yourselves up as God's jury. Go home to your families. Some of the men shuffled their feet, their conviction wavering under the small man's moral authority. But others, their minds set, merely grumbled. The Reverend had bought Luke time, but he had not extinguished the fire. The hunt was still on. In her locked room, Clara descended into a despair deeper than any she had ever known. She cried until she had no tears left, her pleas for freedom echoing off the bare walls. On the third day, Thomas unlocked the door. He stood there, regarding her with cold detachment. "Let me go, Thomas," she whispered, her voice a raw, broken thing. "I will not contest anything. You can have it all. Just let me leave. A divorce." He laughed, a short, ugly, humorless sound. "A divorce? And admit to the world that my wife found me so lacking she preferred a scarred piece of human refuse? Never. You will remain my wife. You will perform your duties, and you will learn your place." "I will not live like this," she said, a spark of her old fire returning. "I will not be your prisoner." "Oh, you will," he said, his eyes glittering with a cruel, triumphant light. "Because I have arranged a way for you to repent. This Sunday, at the service, we will hold a special session of public prayer. For you. For your soul." The cold dread that washed over her was worse than the slap. A public prayer. It was a public shaming disguised as piety. He would force her to kneel before the entire town, before God, and confess her sins. all while he stood beside her. The picture of the forgiving, magnanimous husband. He would not just defeat her. He would use her to elevate himself. It was a masterstroke of cruelty. The next 4 days were a blur of numb horror. Mrs. Gable was allowed in to help her bathe and dress. Her presence a silent, constant surveillance. On Sunday morning, the woman laid out a dress on the bed. It was made of simple, virginal white cotton, the kind a young girl might wear to her first communion. The symbolism was as subtle as a hammer blow. Clara felt a profound, soul-deep weariness as she allowed the housekeeper to dress her, to braid her hair. She felt like a doll, a prop in Thomas's grand theater. She looked at her reflection in the mirror and saw a stranger, a pale, haunted woman with dead eyes, the prisoner, the sinner. But as she stared at that broken reflection, something deep inside her, something she thought had been extinguished forever, began to stir. It was the memory of Luke's touch, the memory of feeling truly alive in the cottage, the memory of her own name, spoken like a prayer. He had risked everything for her. He was being hunted like an animal because of her. She could not honor that sacrifice by meekly kneeling and accepting the false narrative of her own damnation. When Thomas came to her door, his face arranged in a mask of solemn gravity, she was ready. She walked beside him, down the stairs and out to the waiting carriage, her back straight, her head held high. The short ride to town was silent. The church was filled to capacity, a sea of curious, judgmental faces. A hush fell as Thomas led her down the central aisle. She could feel their eyes on her, stripping her bare. He led her to the front pew, indicating with a firm hand that she should kneel at the altar rail. The entire congregation was waiting for this act of submission. Clara looked at the altar, at the stained glass window depicting a meek and gentle Jesus. She looked at the expectant face of Reverend Miller, his expression pained. Then she looked at her husband. She took a step forward, but she did not kneel. Instead, she remained standing, turning slowly to face not the altar, but the assembled people of the town. She found Thomas's gaze in the front row and held it. A collective gasp went through the church. The air crackled with tension. She stood there, in her white dress of supposed penitence, not as a sinner begging for forgiveness, but as a witness ready to testify. A silence, profound and absolute, fell over the church. It was not a reverent silence. It was the stillness of a held breath, the electric quiet before a lightning strike. Every eye was fixed on the lone figure in white standing before them. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, wild thing, but on the outside, she was a statue of newfound resolve. She met the gaze of her husband, who was now rising from the pew, his face a thunderous mask of disbelief and fury. "Clara, kneel," he commanded. His voice a low, menacing growl meant for her alone, yet it carried in the unnatural quiet. She did not move. She drew a breath, a shuddering, unsteady thing. And when she spoke, her voice was not the timid whisper they all knew. It was clear, resonant, and it filled the sacred space. "I am a guilty woman," she began, the words dropping like stones into the silent pool of the congregation. A wave of murmurs rippled through the pews. This was the confession they had come to see. Thomas's face relaxed infinitesimally, believing for a second he had won. But Clara was not finished. "I am guilty," she repeated, her voice gaining strength. "But my sin was not in loving another man." The murmuring stopped, replaced by a sharp, collective intake of breath. Thomas's face hardened again. "My sin," she continued, her gaze sweeping over the faces of the women, the men, the children, "was in allowing myself to live as a ghost for so long. My sin was silence. My sin was accepting a cage, no matter how gilded, and forgetting I had wings. My sin was in believing that a vow made under duress, a vow to settle a debt, was more sacred than the vow a soul makes to itself to simply live." "Hysteria," Thomas boomed, taking a step toward her. "My wife is unwell. Reverend, please We must—
I am not unwell. Thomas, Clara said, turning her full attention to him. The use of his first name, so stark and unadorned, was a shocking act of defiance. I have never been more well. For a year, I have been your property. I have worn the clothes you chose, eaten at the hour you commanded, spoken the words you approved. You did not want a wife. You wanted a beautiful portrait to hang on your wall, a silent testament to your wealth and power. You did not marry a woman. You purchased a silence. The truth of it, spoken aloud in this holy place, was a scandal more potent than any tale of adultery. The story of her father's debt was known to a few, suspected by more. Now, she had laid it bare. This is a house of God, not a stage for a woman's theatrical fancies. Thomas spat, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. She is delirious. Am I? Clara's voice was quiet now, but it carried an edge of steel. She looked past him, her eyes finding Martha, the blacksmith's wife, in the third pew. Martha, do you remember the week after the spring festival, when I came to your husband to have a buckle mended on my boot? Do you remember the bruise on my arm? The one I told you I got from a fall from my horse? Martha's kindly face went pale. She looked from Clara to Thomas, her eyes wide with a dawning, horrified understanding. She remembered. Clara had never been a skilled rider. A fall was plausible. But she also remembered the shape of the bruise, the distinct, cruel marks of fingers that had gripped too hard. At the time, she had pushed the thought away. Now, it returned with sickening clarity. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. And what of the rules? Clara continued, her voice rising again. That I was not to leave the ranch without his permission, that my visits to a sick widow were a privilege he could grant or revoke like a master training a dog. Is that the behavior of a caring husband or a jailer? A younger woman near the back, Mary Beth, who had worked as a seamstress for Thomas's first wife, suddenly stood up. Her face was flushed, her hands trembling. He was the same with her, she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. Yet it seemed to shake the room. With Eleanor, always watching, always telling her who she could see, what she could wear. She told me once she felt like she was suffocating. Mary Beth looked at Thomas, her fear warring with a long-suppressed anger. Eleanor didn't die of a fever, Mr. Blackwood. I think she died of a broken heart. The foundation of Thomas's authority, built on a carefully curated image of respectability and power, was beginning to crack. The narrative he had so carefully constructed was crumbling, being replaced by a far uglier, more believable truth. He was no longer the wronged husband. He was the tyrant. It was in that moment of chaos that the church doors burst open. A man, one of the ranchers from the posse, stood panting in the doorway, his face flushed with excitement. "We got him!" he yelled, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling, oblivious to the drama he was interrupting. "We found the bastard hiding in the old barn by the creek. We're taking him to the jailhouse now." A part of the congregation, the men who had been eager for vengeance, erupted in a cheer. The sound was a desecration in the holy space. For Clara, the shout was a physical blow. They had Luke. The abstract hunt had become a concrete reality. While she was fighting for her truth, he had been captured. The spell in the church was broken. The moral crisis was forgotten, replaced by the primitive, exciting promise of frontier justice. Men began to rise, eager to join the spectacle. Thomas saw his opportunity. With the focus shifted, he could reassert control. He strode to Clara's side, his face a mask of cold fury. "This is what you have wrought," he hissed, his fingers digging into her arm. "His blood is on your hands." He began to pull her toward the side door, to drag her back to her prison. But something had fundamentally changed. Clara was no longer pliant. She planted her feet. "No," she said, her voice shaking but firm. And then another voice cut through the noise. "Let her go! Thomas!" It was Reverend Miller. He had come down from the pulpit and stood between them, his small frame seeming to possess an almost supernatural authority. "This church will not be a party to your cruelty or the town's vengeance. Release your wife." Thomas, for the first time in his life, found himself facing a force his power could not bend. To assault a man of God in his own church, in front of the entire town, was a line even he could not cross. His hand fell away from Clara's arm. The crowd began to spill out of the church, a human river flowing toward the town's small, clapboard jailhouse. Clara felt a hand on her elbow. It was the Reverend. "Come with me, my child," he said softly. "There is little time." He did not lead her out the main doors, but through a small side door that led to his study. From there, they slipped out the back, away from the baying crowd. He led her through the back alleys of the town, their progress hidden from the main street, where a mob was now gathering outside the sheriff's office. The jail was a small, solid-looking building of brick and iron. A crowd of 50 men, their faces a mixture of excitement and grim satisfaction, milled about outside. Sheriff Brody stood on the steps, a shotgun held loosely in his arms, looking overwhelmed. "Go home," he was shouting. "The law will handle this." "The law takes too long." "Brody," someone yelled back. "We know how to deal with his kind." Reverend Miller led Clara to the back of the building, to a small, barred window that looked into the single cell, and there, in the dim light, she saw him. Luke was slumped on a narrow cot, his head in his hands. He was battered and bruised, a fresh, bloody cut on his forehead, when he heard the scuff of their shoes on the dirt outside. He looked up. His eyes, when they found hers through the bars, were filled with a profound, soul-deep agony. But it was not for himself. It was for her. "Clara," he breathed, moving to the window, his hands gripping the cold iron bars. "You shouldn't be here. I had to see you," she said, her own hands reaching through the bars to touch his. His fingers were cold, but his grip was strong, desperate. "Luke, I am so sorry." "Don't," he said, his voice rough. "This is not your fault. It's mine. I should have kept riding. I never should have." "No," she said, her voice fierce, her tears finally beginning to fall. "The moments I had with you were the only real moments of my life. I am not sorry for them. I will never be sorry for them." She looked at his beaten face, at the exhaustion and pain in his eyes, and her heart broke. They were trapped, both of them, in cages made by the same man. "They mean to kill you, don't they?" she whispered, the words a terrible, bitter taste in her mouth. He didn't answer, but the grim set of his jaw was answer enough. He knew what a mob was capable of. He had seen it in the war. There would be no trial. She gripped his hands tighter, pressing her face against the cold, unyielding bars. She needed him to know. She needed the last thing he heard from her to be the truth. "Luke, listen to me," she said, her voice choked with tears but clear and steady. "I don't know what will happen. I don't know if I will ever see you again, but I want you to know this. No matter what they do, no matter what happens to us, I still choose you, in my heart, in my soul. I choose you." A single tear traced a path through the grime on his cheek. He leaned forward, his forehead resting against the bars, as close to her as he could get. "And are you, Clara?" he whispered. "Always." "There is still hope." The Reverend's voice was a quiet anchor in their sea of despair. He had been standing back, giving them their moment. "The town is not one single voice. Your words in the church, they planted a seed of doubt. Clara, a seed of truth." As if to prove his words, they could hear the sounds from the front of the jailhouse changing. The unified, angry roar was gone, replaced by the discordant sound of arguments. Reverend Miller had gone back to the church. He had not rung the bell for a service, but for an emergency, as people, drawn by the sound, began to trickle back. He did not offer a sermon. He called for a prayer for truth, a prayer for mercy, a prayer for the soul of their community, which, he told them, was in mortal danger of being corrupted by hatred and vengeance. His words, combined with Clara's testimony and Mary Beth's shocking statement, had done their work. The town was fracturing. On the street corners, men argued, some loyal to Thomas or simply in love with the idea of swift, violent justice, insisted Luke must hang. But others, their certainty shaken, began to speak of trials, of evidence, of the unsettling things Clara had said. The women, in particular, were talking. The whispers that had once condemned Luke were now turning toward Thomas. The stories of his coldness, his pride, his first wife's quiet, sad decline, were being re-examined in a new, harsher light. The town had split in two. One side, led by the specter of Thomas Blackwood, demanded a rope. The other, rallied by the quiet courage of a determined reverend, was beginning to call for something else entirely: justice. The battle for Luke's life had become the battle for the town's soul. The night that followed was a crucible. The town simmered, a pot left too long on the fire. At the saloon, Thomas Blackwood bought rounds of whiskey, his voice a low, authoritative rumble as he stoked the flames of outrage, painting Luke as a devil and himself as the long-suffering saint. A core group of his loyalists and the town's more brutish elements grew louder and drunker, their calls for a rope becoming more insistent as the moon climbed higher. But elsewhere, a quieter fire was being kindled. In the church, Reverend Miller spoke not to a congregation, but to a small, hand-picked group of men and women gathered in the pews. They were not the town's wealthiest or most powerful, but they were its heart. There was the blacksmith, a mountain of a man whose hands could shape iron but whose face was soft with worry. His wife, Martha, sat beside him, her hands clenched in her lap, her mind still replaying Clara's raw testimony. There was the doctor, an old, weary man who had seen too much of the cruelty humans could inflict on one another. And there were others, a handful of farmers and merchants who believed a man, any man, deserved a trial, not a mob. "Thomas has Sheriff Brody pinned," the blacksmith said, his voice a low rumble. "The sheriff's a good man, but he's weak. He won't be able to hold them off if they get a full head of steam." "Then we cannot rely on the law to provide justice," Reverend Miller stated, his voice calm but imbued with an iron certainty. "Because what is coming for that boy in the jail is not justice. It is a lynching, and our Lord does not command us to stand by while a sin is committed. He commands us to act." The plan they forged was one of quiet rebellion, born of necessity and courage. Meanwhile, in her cold, sparse room, Clara was a prisoner of a different kind. She had been dragged back to the ranch, her brief, fiery rebellion seemingly crushed. Thomas had not spoken to her, had not even looked at her. He had simply locked the door, the sound of the key a final, damning verdict. She knew what was happening in town. She could feel the hatred coalescing, aimed like a loaded gun at the man she loved. Helplessness was a physical sickness, a poison that left her weak and trembling. Just after midnight, when the house was as silent as a tomb, she heard a faint scratching at her door. Not the confident turn of a key, but something small, metallic, probing the lock. Her heart leapt into her throat. She pressed her ear to the cold wood, listening. A moment later, with a soft click, the lock gave way. The door opened a crack, and Martha, the blacksmith's wife, slipped inside, a single candle held in her trembling hand. Her face was a mixture of fear and fierce determination. "There is no time to waste," Martha whispered, holding out a bundle of clothes. "The Reverend sent me. They're getting him out." Clara stared at her, dumbfounded. "But how?" "My husband can open any lock in this town," Martha said with a flicker of pride. "And I couldn't sleep. What you said in that church, what he did to you, it was a sin to stay silent. I'm sorry I was silent for so long. Child." The clothes she offered were not the fine wools and cottons of Clara's married life. It was a simple, worn dress of brown calico, the kind a farmer's daughter would wear. It was one of Clara's old dresses, one she had brought with her from her father's home, stored away and forgotten. Without a word, Clara stripped off the white dress of her public shame and pulled on the simple brown one. It was more than a change of clothing. It was a shedding of an identity. In that worn calico, she was no longer Mrs. Thomas Blackwood. She was Clara May Thompson once more. She took nothing else, not a piece of jewelry, not a hairpin, not a single coin. She would leave this gilded cage with only the clothes on her back and the love in her heart. They crept through the sleeping house, two shadows on a desperate mission, and slipped out into the cold, moonlit night. At the jailhouse, the mob was a restless, drunken beast. The Reverend's counter-movement had been successful. He and the doctor had drawn away the more thoughtful or pious townsfolk, engaging them in a prolonged, passionate debate about law and morality on the church steps. What remained at the jail was the hard core, the men who thirsted for violence. The blacksmith, under the cover of a loud, drunken song, worked silently at the back of the jail. The lock on the cell door was old, but well made. It took him a full 10 minutes, each scrape of his tools amplified in the tense silence, before he finally coaxed it open. Luke, battered and weary, was on his feet in an instant. There were no words, only a grateful, desperate nod. They slipped out into the alley just as a fresh wave of shouting erupted from the front. Sheriff Brody, making a final, valiant stand, had fired his shotgun into the air. The blast was the perfect cover for their escape. They met Clara at the church, the prearranged sanctuary. She saw Luke emerge from the shadows, leaning heavily on the blacksmith, and her heart both broke and soared. She ran to him, and he let go of his support to take her in his arms. It was a brief, desperate embrace, a silent acknowledgement of all they had survived. "We have a wagon waiting a mile east of town," the Reverend said, pressing a small, heavy pouch of coins into Luke's hand. "It's not much, but it will help you get started. Go west, don't look back, and may God go with you." Clara turned to the small group who had risked everything for them. There were no words sufficient to thank them. She simply looked at each of them, at Martha's tear-streaked face, at the blacksmith's stoic nod, at the Reverend's kind, unwavering eyes, and poured all of her gratitude into that single, silent look. Then she took Luke's hand. His was rough and calloused. Hers was soft, but they fit together as if they had been made for each other. Hand in hand, they walked away from the church, away from the town, away from the lives that had almost destroyed them. They did not run. They walked with a quiet, solemn dignity. Two solitary figures melting into the vast, dark expanse of the prairie, leaving the shouting and the judgment and the hatred behind them. In the weeks and months that followed, the town that had been their crucible slowly healed, but it was forever changed. Thomas Blackwood won the battle but lost the war. His wife was gone. His enemy had escaped, and his carefully constructed facade of respectability was shattered beyond repair. People no longer looked at him with deference and fear. They looked at him with a mixture of pity and contempt. His power, which had always relied on the perception of his righteousness, evaporated. The men who had been his loyal followers now avoided his gaze. The women of the town, emboldened by Clara's courage, spoke in whispers that were a constant, corrosive judgment. His grand house, once a symbol of his dominion, became his mausoleum. He lived out his days in a bitter, opulent solitude, a king of a silent, empty kingdom. Far to the west, where the sky was bigger and the land was wild and unnamed, Clara and Luke began to build their new world. They traveled until the money ran out, and then they found a small, unclaimed valley nestled between two mesas, a place of stark, breathtaking beauty. A creek ran through it, lined with cottonwood trees, and the earth was rich and dark. Life was hard. It was a world away from the starched linens and polished silver of the ranch. Their first home was a crude lean-to built against the side of a rock face. They lived on what Luke could hunt and what Clara could forage. Her hands, once soft and pale, became chapped and calloused from tilling a small garden and washing their clothes in the cold creek water. His body, already a map of old battles, acquired new aches from felling trees and clearing land. But it was a good hardship. It was the ache of effort, not of despair. Every stone they moved, every seed they planted, was an act of creation, a testament to their survival. They rarely spoke of the past. There was no need. The understanding between them was a deep, quiet river. In the evenings, they would sit by their small fire, his arm around her, and watch the stars emerge in the vast, unpolluted sky. The silence between them was not the empty, oppressive silence of the ranch. It was a comfortable, peaceful silence, full of unspoken love and shared contentment. They were not just lovers, they were partners, building a life from the ground up, with nothing but their own two hands and their two resilient hearts. One evening, as the sun began to set, painting the canyon walls in fiery shades of orange and deep violet, Clara stood watching Luke. He was sketching in the dirt with a stick, planning the small, sturdy log cabin that would be their permanent home. He was completely absorbed, his brow furrowed in concentration. The setting sun caught the side of his face, illuminating the long, puckered scar that had once defined him in the eyes of the world. She walked over to him and knelt in the dirt beside him. She reached out and gently traced the scar with her fingertip, a touch now as familiar and comforting as his heartbeat. He stopped his sketching and looked at her, his eyes soft in the warm light. "That scar doesn't make you ugly, Luke," she said, her voice quiet but full of a conviction that was absolute. "It makes you the man I love." A slow, genuine smile spread across his face, a smile she had helped him find again. It transformed him, erasing the last shadows of the haunted soldier and revealing the gentle, steadfast man beneath. He said nothing, but reached out and tucked a stray strand of her wheat-colored hair behind her ear, his touch speaking volumes. As darkness fell, a single lamp was lit inside their small, makeshift shelter. Its warm, golden light was a tiny pinprick against the immense, wild landscape, a fragile beacon of defiance and hope. It was the light of a poor home, but it was brilliantly, fiercely free. It was the light of a love that had refused to be caged, a love that had found its own definition, not in the rigid doctrines of men, but in the simple, sacred truth of two hearts beating as one. Thank you so much for listening to our story tonight. We're always curious to know where our stories travel. Please leave a comment below and let us know where in the world you're listening from. We'd love to hear your thoughts on Clara and Luke's journey. Don't forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel for more tales from the frontier.